Many years ago, the great New Testament scholar Martin Hengel said there was a danger in young exegetes knowing a great deal about a single book, the critical edition of the New Testament, and not realising that there was a vast library of material in Greek that belonged to that world and without which that book was without context. At the heart of that book lie 4 texts, the Gospels, which have a biographical form. They were produced in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. Exactly contemporaneous with the composition of those 4 texts is another body of biographies by the great Greek writer Plutarch. With me, I've Professor Judith Mossman, our Professor of Classics, and you actually are one of the great authorities on Plutarch.
That's very kind, thank you.
Okay, will you introduce to us Plutarch, this other biographer?
With pleasure. Actually, Plutarch, I think, must have been something of a pleasure to meet. He was well off, a member of the Greek elite, as we say. He was born in a little place called Chaeronea, which is in Boeotia, sort of on the road between Athens and Delphi. It's not a big place, and he says at the beginning of one of his biographies that he continues to live there so that it may not become any smaller, which is a nice example, I think, of a slightly humorous cast of mind. He was a Roman citizen. His Roman name was Lucius Mestrius Plutarchus, and he was acquainted with some very important people in the Roman Empire. His biographies are dedicated to Sosius Senecio, who was consul with the Emperor Trajan in a sort of honorary capacity at the beginning of Trajan's reign. Now, Plutarch is best known as a political biographer, and a lot of the most engaging aspects of him are on display in those political biographies. It's also very important that they're arranged in pairs. The full title of them is The Parallel Lives. And in these pairs, he takes one Greek figure and one Roman figure. The Greek figures are from all over Greece, so some Macedonian, like Alexander the Great, some Athenian, like Pericles, some Spartan, like Lycurgus or Lysander. And he pairs them with Romans, partly sometimes on the grounds that their lives have a similar sort of trajectory or can be given a similar sort of trajectory, but also partly simply, as far as one can see, because he sees them as similar personalities. One of the wonderful things about Plutarch is how complex the characters that he presents really are. They're not all admirable by any means. Some of them are extremely dysfunctional. Some of them start well and end badly. Some of them end less badly than they started out. The characters are really created through the deployment of a multitude of anecdotes, some of which have become absolutely iconic. His telling, for example, of the taming of Bucephalus by the young Alexander is a very famous scene. If you look indeed at some of the recent film version of Alexander, or pretty much any film version of the life of Alexander the Great, you'll find it heavily invested with Plutarch's life. The other thing, though, is that you do sometimes get Plutarch's own opinions formed in the text or presented in the text, and a very clear personality of the biographer emerging through his responses to the anecdotes that he tells. He gets very annoyed with Cato for wanting to sell on elderly slaves and says, "I wouldn't do that to a dog, let alone an old man." He gets really quite annoyed, it seems, in terms of self-presentation with that attitude. He was also the master of theatricality in all sorts of areas of his writing. He's responsible for our picture of Cleopatra at the end of her life, discovered by the Romans lying in the full panoply of Egyptian monarchy. That is something that Shakespeare found immensely impressive, of course, and it's something again that we've seen in modern versions of Cleopatra. It's not credited to Plutarch, but that's where we get it from. It's also the case that he uses other genres to enrich his writing. So very much references to tragedy, references to comedy, but also using his great historical predecessors, Thucydides, in particular, when he's covering some of the same material. He used to be regarded, I think, pretty much as a treasure house for authors that we'd lost, and not given enough credit for shaping his material into really artistic prose and very striking portraits of complex characters. But I think that's why we enjoy reading him as a biographer today.
And one of the things about his biographies is that each life has a certain sequence. It begins with birth, youth, education, then anecdotes that illustrate the end, and then the morals.
Yes. He often, though not invariably, concludes a pair with a comparison of the two characters. And those comparisons, quite short comparisons sometimes, very much point the moral in a way that sometimes hasn't always emerged exactly in such stark black and white terms from the narratives. But he is very much, again, the person who's influenced the creation of modern biography, I think, in terms of very much starting at the beginning and moving through and ending with the death or with some comment on the influence of the person who's died. So at the end of the Cicero, what you get is in fact not poor old Cicero's miserable end, but much later a young relative of the Emperor Augustus embarrassedly hiding a volume of the speeches of Cicero, and Augustus producing, hoisting in on the book and taking it from the young boy's hands and looking at it and saying, "Ah, yes, he was a learned man, my child, and a lover of his country." A sort of verdict of history type ending. That is worth saying because not all ancient biography does that. Suetonius does things quite differently and groups stories thematically rather than chronologically. If Plutarch plays around with chronology, which he sometimes does, he's got an agenda, and it's very important to notice it.
Thank you for bringing us through Plutarch, because for many of the people who read the Gospels, a study of Plutarch's lives is, both in their similarities and their differences, is probably one of the best ways that they can use contemporaneous material to help their own exegesis.
Yes, I think that's very true. There are some other ancient biographies, such as Lives of the Philosophers, which might also have some relation to the Gospels. But actually, in terms of the artistry of the structure and the weight which is given to each anecdote and the complexity of each anecdote, I think Plutarch probably has more to say to exegetes of the Gospels than any sort of life of the philosopher that we have, which is simply called a biography as opposed to being a biographical work, slightly more complex biographical work, such as the dialogues of Plato or the memorabilia of Xenophon. And I think in terms of comparable, more or less comparable length and structure, I think Plutarch is closer to the Gospels than either of those portrayals of Socrates.
Judith, thank you very much.